C++ Club, the 8th of August 2019. Nathan Myers posted on Reddit what happened to C++20 contracts, and boy, what a show it is. His post says, "This was the first time in exactly 30 years since ISO was first asked to form a working group to standardize C++ that the committee has removed from its working draft a major feature for no expressible technical reason. Almost immediately after the feature was voted in, one party to the original agreement, authors of the rejected 2012 design, began to post a bewildering variety of proposals for radical changes to the design, promoting them by encouraging confusion about consequences of the agreed-upon design." He then says, "One of the proposals, not seen before the day it was presented, seemed to offer that simplicity, presumably promised by some other discussions, and the group seized upon it, voting for it by a margin of 3-1. It was opposed by 4 of the 5 participants of the original design group, because it was fatally flawed. In use, programmers would need to define preprocessor macros and put calls to those in their code instead of the core language syntax defined. It would breed macro hell. On top of its inherent flaws, it amounted to a radical redesign from what was originally accepted by the full committee. The immediate predictable effect was panic. 2 days later, the same evolution working group voted to remove the feature entirely." And you have to see this thread to get an impression of the kind of feedback and emotion. Nathan goes into some history of the contracts feature, and then he says what happened in Cologne. He says, "The profusion of change proposals continued in Cologne. Most proposals suggested making the feature more complex and harder to understand. The impression they created was of a feature that was unstable and unclear, even though they identified no actual problems with the version in the draft." This is just so bad. He says he doesn't hold back, basically. He tells what happened. Of all the accounts I've read, this is the most emotional, and I don't even know how to say it. I think this is what happened. And predictably, the slew of comments that followed was full of various kinds of emotions, finger pointing, blame, and the first comment was by Bryce Lelbach, who reminded committee members participating in the discussion that quoting or attributing comments made during meetings to particular individuals is not okay under ISO policies. Despite how you might feel about the original poster's position, his post does a good job of avoiding violations of this rule. So he didn't actually name the people involved, but those who were in the meeting probably know who were those people. And Bryce later added, "Also, everyone please keep it civil." Yeah, right. Someone called Sempuki says the author of this screed is not a reliable source and won't recognize his contributions to the outcome, including a previous paper to pull the feature as well. So Nathan did submit a paper called for pulling the contracts, but that was probably his expression of the frustration that he felt, because he's been working on contracts for quite a long time, apparently. And this Sempuki person says the reason it was pulled was simple. The original authors and all of the of UG agreed it wasn't ready because it didn't fully meet the needs of anyone. And that, I don't think that's exactly what it was about. I don't think that's the whole truth. Also, fully meeting the needs of everyone shouldn't be a requirement, as this person Kalmok says in reply to that. Orange Olivero says there was a paper to do just this: remove the controversial features and keep in the bare minimum that everyone could agree on. And Karentin replies to that the paper that was mentioned in the post was utterly unusable without macros. It was therefore going against everything else we tried to achieve with modules, and I'm glad that the direction was ultimately rejected, both for the sake of the language and the ecosystem. Use of macros are a sign of unsatisfying language support. Right, what else? Someone asks if that was a paper from Bjarne Strostrup to remove the controversial features. And Bjarne himself replies that it wasn't, and his opinions were documented in the paper 1711, What to Do About Contracts. And he proposed at the time, just before Cologne, to either do a minimal fix to status quo or do nothing, leave status quo in place, and the third choice would be remove contracts from the working paper. It's a sad state of affairs from my point of view, and I'm completely out of the loop. I'm only watching from a side, reading the posts, mainly on Reddit. Vini Falco says, this is actually a success story, by which I suspect he means pulling the contracts all together because of the disagreement and the lack of consensus. Super V1234, who is Vittorio Romeo, says, I find it ironic that the author of this post is also the author of paper proposal 1426, Pull the Plug on Contracts, which I mentioned earlier. A paper in the ISO mailing list advocating for the removal of contracts from the language. You shouldn't read into the title of the paper, you shouldn't take it at face value, because this is expression of the frustration of the author. But this is an easy way of discrediting this post by Nathan Myers by bringing up this paper that he wrote earlier. Vittorio uses words like falsehoods that damage the reputation of the committee and harm the future of contracts, because he takes an issue with the phrase that the contracts were removed for no expressible technical reason of any kind. And he goes into the details of what he thinks were the technical reasons for removing it. I think most of the papers were submitted by the group mentioned in the original post, or the people influenced by that group. He says then, in conclusion, I want to reassure, in boldface, the C++ community that the removal of contracts was a decision highly motivated by technical reasons and not FUD. 14Ned he's the author of the Boost Outcome library. He is Niall Douglas. Niall Douglas says, in fairness, paper 1426, Pull the Plug on Contracts, was concerned with problems with process and the constant over-insertion of non-expert and ignorant opinion from some in EUG. In other words, the original poster raised all the issues he did in an early and timely fashion, and nobody listened. And then there's some shit-throwing back and forth, which is, I've never seen anything like it in a thread on RCPP related to committee activity. It's really shocking, to be honest. Raw emotion in many replies, including some technical details. And this is a really insightful comment by Hleedril, who says, as a bystander who has no engagement here and knows nothing of the details, but feels a self-destructive angst in this tirade, I think it is time for somebody to take a very long walk, think hard about the failings and how they can approach the problems in a different way, more conducive to getting something into the standard. Niall Douglas then says, For the record, the original poster who I work with at my day job is one of the core founders of the study group, and nobody would argue that he isn't and hasn't focused his energy correspondingly. You have to remember how gutting it is to carefully pilot something over many years through WG21 only for it to get redesigned by committee at the final stage. If it happened to me, and it probably will, I'm not sure I'd be as restrained as Nathan is being. And then he says, it is tough to be in the committee room hearing completely stupid, ill-formed things repeatedly coming out of the mouths of people who should know better and keep your temper. Oh my. Niall doesn't hold back either. Then Orange Oliveira says, the original authors were in a disagreement over whether contracts were usable in their current state. Niall Douglas says later, I spoke with the original authors throughout the meeting, he says, and I did not get that feeling at all. What I got was that there was a disagreement between them about details, but not about overall design and premise. The original poster did not throw a fit, he says. I read the original post as raising important questions about process. Niall then says, I don't mind redesigning by the people who genuinely know their stuff. Their feedback tends to be very high quality, even if I think it completely wrong, but you always can see why they think that way, and it is hence with great respect that I view their opinion. He then goes on, but as we go ever further into the niche specialist topics in the standard, the reality is that the majority of 200 plus people have unhelpful opinions, mostly based out of ignorance. Some of them are very big names on the committee too. Said people need to accept that complete redesign late-stage feedback is no longer useful in a large committee. Either get in your feedback very early on when a proposal is around the incubator stage, or accept whatever reaches the group as complete and inviolate as the only game in town. No late-breaking change the world proposals. I think that was mentioned in one of the earlier papers about the committee process. Someone mentions a CPP cast episode with Bertrand Below and Tom Honeyman where they discuss what happened to the contracts, and they didn't put it in exactly that emotional form as the original poster did, and they probably lacked some details of what happened or didn't voice them. There is also a link to the Bertrand Below's Cologne trip report, which mentions the breakdown of consensus and goes into the details of the papers submitted at Cologne. And those papers are the ones the original poster here mentioned. When reading this thread, you have to keep in mind that most people posting here have no first person information on what happened, and I think the original poster has, and so I mostly believe him. And that's why looking at the thread and the replies and the mudslinging going on, I think I despair, and I think it's a bad state of affairs, and I really don't feel optimistic about this feature, because if the same people are going to work on contracts further in the study group, then who knows what we'll get, or whether we even get anything as planned. Anyway, as Bryce Lelbach said on Twitter, 50% of C++ programmers say the committee is moving too fast. 50% of C++ programmers, the committee is moving too slow. #CPP20. York Brown overheard at the C++ standards meeting and posted on Twitter someone say, libraries does naming, core does punctuation. Evolution imagines that they provide solutions to real problems. Core provides real solutions to imaginary problems. Right, back from the fray into the world of day-to-day development. A new post on the Microsoft blog talks about improvements in linker fundamentals in Visual Studio 2019. They rewrote quite a bit of linker, and the result is vastly faster linker performance in debug builds, mainly, I think. They took some open source projects and provided some benchmarks and comparisons between the old 15.9 version and this preview version, and the difference is quite staggering. They took some AAA games that showed long link times and, as they say, are representative of large production C++ source bases, and they were some of the most challenging linker inputs. And the difference here is quite big. Technical vision for Qt 6. There was a post on the new upcoming version for Qt 6 published by Lars Knoll, and the gist of it is they are basing the new version on C++ 17. QML will gain strong types. There will be a possibility of compilation QML to C++, and they are going to make JavaScript optional to support devices with low system resources that can't have the entire JavaScript interpreter in them. They are switching to CMake as the build system. QMake will still be supported, will still be available, but won't be supported or developed further. And they also will support next generation graphics. Instead of OpenGL, they will support Vulkan and Metal on macOS. Scott Myers came up with this trick to get a type of a thing in your source code. If you're not sure what the type of a variable or an entity is, you can use this template trick where you declare a template, a struct template, but don't define it. And so it looks like template, type name t, struct td, but there's no definition. So now if you write something like td angle brackets decal type foo, then you get an error message, and the error message tells you exactly the type of foo as deduced by decal type, which in this case is what you want. So that's a useful trick in the absence of, say, intelligent IntelliSense. You can use it to determine what type a particular thing has in your program. Someone posted on Reddit that they started learning C++ after spending years with Python, and they just realized that the Python has been their programming mama, doing my laundry and spoon-feeding me all the time. Then they mention the incomprehensible error messages that C++ is famous for, and while that is bound to improve with the introduction of concepts, someone says that the new GCC compiler with color highlighting is a little bit better at pointing out errors. It's generally quite helpful for pure C, C++ until you make an error with the standard library and you get 200 lines about std : whatever random characters. In C++, a trick I always use, some poster says, when the error message is massive, is to just focus on the first error. There is an article about using constexpr for faster, smaller and safer code. This article by on the Trail of Bits blog mentions use cases for ConstExpert, including getting rid of undefined behavior. There's a project by the author, who is Alessandro Gario. The project is called ConstExpert for Everything. It's a Clang extension that takes your source code and applies ConstExpert wherever possible. That is too scary for my taste, to feed my code to an automated tool that makes changes to it. Yeah, maybe it's worth a try. I've heard a notion that whenever a new feature appears in C++, people start using it everywhere indiscriminately, and only after some time common usage patterns appear and people start judging the situation better and deciding better whether to use that particular feature or not. I think we are now in the stage of ConstExpert when it's being used everywhere for everything, and that might change in the future. Some new patterns might emerge and we'll get used to the feature and it'll be more usable to everyone, and it'll feel normal in everyday's use. So for now, yeah, go wild. ConstExpert for everything. See what happens. There's a new build tool in town. It's called Bake. We have Fake for F#, we have Rake for Ruby, and now we have Bake for weird. Anyway, this is a tool inspired by Cargo, which is Rust's package manager and build system. The advantage of Bake seems to be that there's a lot of built-in intelligence, so that when you provide a bare minimum of information in a JSON configuration file, Bake can figure out all the used subprojects and build them for you, and build the main project as well, without you doing anything else. So that's a lot of smarts built into the tool, and for some people, including me, that's probably too much magic. German Aerospace Center posted a project on GitHub, which is a virtual universe which lets you explore, analyze, and present huge planetary datasets and large simulation data in real time. It's called Cosmos Scout VR. There is a to-do list in the README file, and there are some checkboxes still unchecked. For example, it doesn't do shadow rendering or HDR rendering at the moment. It doesn't run on macOS, it runs on Linux and Windows only. But for an early project on GitHub, it's really full-featured. It positions celestial bodies, satellites, star catalogs, renders configurable atmospheres. It has a flexible user interface, and it has a pretty comprehensive hardware device support. It supports HTC Vive 3D headset, some multi-screen systems, side-by-side stereo systems, anaglyph stereo systems. There are sample screenshots. It looks really impressive. It has quite a long list of dependencies, including Boost, Chromium that is used for WebKit, for the WebKit-based user interface, lots of other libraries. It serves almost like a list of useful libraries to keep in mind. Really impressive. Space. I like space. So that's it for today, and I'll leave you with this verse found on Twitter. 99 little bugs in the code. 99 little bugs in the code. Take one down, patch it around. 127 little bugs in the code. And that's a situation we are all too familiar being C++ programmers. That's it for today. Talk to you next week. Bye.